bring in Congressman Adam Schiff of California, a candidate for United States Senate and a former member of the January 6th Select Committee. Hopefully you were able to hear Michael Isikoff, great journalism there. But are you concerned, Congressman, from a national security perspective, that Donald Trump, who is desperate for money and who needs to be president in order to make the cases against him, the federal cases, go away, is turning to Manafort again?
Absolutely. And, let's remember that during that 2016 campaign, while Manafort is the chair of the campaign, he's secretly meeting with this Russian intelligence officer or operative, Konstantin Kilimnik, as you were discussing, giving them internal campaign polling information. This is the same Russian intelligence that is hacking and dumping the DNC documents, that is, working with a troll farm in St. Petersburg to try to, essentially run a covert social media campaign for Donald Trump. So he is effectively the liaison between the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence. And as part of that relationship, he's also involved in a pro-Russian plan for eastern Ukraine. What could there possibly be to worry about in having someone like that brought into a presidential campaign again? Not to mention the fact that he was tried and convicted of various fraudulent activities, including those around not registering as a foreign agent, involved with trying to intimidate other witnesses. And we don't know even more about his role and his relationship with Russian intelligence because he used encrypted apps and he refused to cooperate when it came to Kilimnik. So all kinds of sirens going on with this prospect.
And by the way, it does kind of make you sit back and think about the fact that Donald Trump said he would allow Putin to do whatever the hell he wants to our NATO allies. And he's doubled down on getting his apparatchiks in the House of Representatives to refuse to fund Ukraine. Donald Trump needs money. Vladimir Putin might be the world's richest man because he's robbed all of the oligarchs that he has under his control. Does it concern you that perhaps what Donald Trump is hoping to trade for help from Russia, again, to get himself back in the White House, is Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely. What we saw in the first presidential campaign when he was lying about having any business dealings in Russia, even as Michael Cohen, his lawyer, was on the phone with the Kremlin right up to the point of the Republican convention, trying to make this deal for Moscow Trump Tower, something that Bob Mueller found would be the most lucrative deal of Donald Trump's life. He was willing to do that even when he wasn't in all this kind of debt that he is in now with these judgments against him. He is more financially imperiled now, I think, than ever before. More economic incentive, more greed operating here now than in the past. And Ukraine is in a much more vulnerable position. He has a lot more to offer the Kremlin dictator. So it is a grave, as the Senate bipartisan report said, a grave counterintelligence risk to have Manafort anywhere near that campaign.
In addition to that, we know that Donald Trump is facing maybe, I don't know if the trial will ever happen because Judge Aileen Cannon doesn't seem interested in having the trial ever happen. But if that case were to go forward, Donald Trump is accused of stealing national security secrets up to and including nuclear secrets that he is also accused of sharing with people who didn't have the right to access to them. How would we even find out if Donald Trump decided that that is something that might be something that's useful for Manafort to broker around the world? I'm just trying to use my lurid imagination with Donald Trump, which I think we sometimes have failed to do.
Well, it doesn't really require that lurid of an imagination. It just requires recollection. You'll recall in his meeting with Putin when he essentially banished everyone out of the room. He didn't want witnesses to his conversation with Putin. And as I recall, I think he was reliant even on the interpreter or the Russian interpreter. I don't even know if it was his or Putin's. So there's lots of reason to be concerned about any private conversation he might have with Putin, but also whatever he would relate to Paul Manafort about national security or intelligence matters that might be of interest or value to Russian intelligence. It's exactly the reason why I think when the intelligence community briefs him as the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, they're going to really dumb down anything they tell him because they know they can't trust him with whatever they share.
I have two more quick questions. One, your reaction to Peter Navarro now finally serving time.
Well, I think it's a very important affirmation of the fact you can't just thumb your nose at a subpoena. There's no separate standard for cronies of Donald Trump. And without a penalty like going to jail, when people receive congressional subpoenas, they'll just say, well, this is optional. Now, I think a congressional subpoena has real teeth, and that's vitally important for our oversight role.
Let me play you a piece of sound of Donald Trump with apologies to how offensive it is and get your reaction.
When you see those Palestinian marches, even I'm amazed at how many people are in those marches. And guys like Schumer see that, and to him it's votes. I think it's votes more than anything else, because he was always pro-Israel. He's very anti-Israel now. Any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion, they hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Congressman, you yourself have faced some of those pro-Palestinian protests. Some of the protesters are themselves Jewish people. What do you make of the idea that Donald Trump has said that anyone who doesn't vote for him hates their religion if they are Jewish?
You know, it's hard to begin to explain how offensive that is. It ought to be offensive to everyone. It's certainly offensive to anyone in the Jewish community. But the very idea that Donald Trump would think he's in a position to be advising Jewish people about their own faith, he's not in a position to advise anyone about anyone's faith. If he knew even the first thing about Judaism, he would understand, you know, the obligation of tikkun olam, the respect we have for efforts to mend the broken parts of our world. And if anyone is the antithesis to those Jewish values, it is someone like Donald Trump, who is so determined to divide, pit American against American, and further break this very damaged world we live in.
Yeah, he might want to stop saying Hitler did good things before he starts advising Jewish people on what they ought to do and how they ought to vote. Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you very much. And